He was the one inmate everyone said had nothing to lose. Then one night he saw something he shouldn't have, and 3 weeks later he was found cold on his cell floor. The official report said his heart just stopped. Nobody believed it, not even the guards. He was the one inmate everyone said had nothing to lose. Then one night he saw something he shouldn't have. 3 weeks later he was found cold on his cell floor. The official report said his heart just stopped. Nobody believed it. Not even the guards. This is the story of Daniel Reyes, a prison, a secret, and the woman who ran both. Greystone Correctional wasn't the kind of place you found by accident. It sat 2 hours from the nearest town, surrounded by pine trees and silence, the kind of silence that made the walls feel thicker than they were. Daniel Reyes had lived inside those walls for 11 years. He had 4 left. 4 years of counting ceiling tiles, 4 years of watching the same gray sky through the same narrow window. He wasn't the loudest man in the yard, and he wasn't the strongest either. But he was smart, the kind of smart that kept a man alive in a place like this. Daniel had learned early on that survival wasn't about muscle. It was about reading people, knowing who was about to snap, knowing which guard would look the other way for a favor and which one would write you up for breathing wrong. He kept his head down, he worked the laundry room. He ate alone mostly unless someone needed to talk. People trusted him with things they wouldn't tell anyone else, not because he was kind exactly, but because he never repeated anything. Daniel had a way of listening that made people forget he was still a stranger. At night, lying on his thin mattress, he sometimes wondered what he had left to actually lose. His wife had stopped writing years ago. His daughter didn't know his voice anymore. The world outside had moved on without him, and some nights that thought was heavier than the sentence itself. Then there was Warden Elaine Cross. She'd taken over Greystone 6 years earlier, and the place had changed the moment she walked in. Cross was not the kind of warden who stayed behind her desk. She walked the halls herself unannounced at odd hours. She knew inmates by name, not just their numbers. Guards respected her. Some feared her more than they feared each other. She ran the facility like it was hers to protect, and nobody, staff or inmate, ever quite figured out what she was protecting it from. She was calm in a way that felt rehearsed, controlled, like a woman who had built herself brick by brick and made sure no one could see the cracks. Daniel had spoken to her only a handful of times over the years, routine check-ins, nothing more. But there was something about the way she looked at him sometimes, a half-second longer than she looked at anyone else, that he couldn't quite explain. It was late on a Tuesday when he saw her somewhere she shouldn't have been. He was on his way back from the infirmary, a guard trailing a few steps behind, when he passed the maintenance corridor near the east wing, an area that should have been locked, empty, dark at that hour. But the door was cracked open. And through the gap, just for a second, he saw her, not in her office, not doing rounds, standing perfectly still in the shadows like she was waiting for someone. Daniel didn't say anything. He kept walking, eyes forward, heart ticking a little faster than it should have. But some part of him, the part that had survived 11 years by noticing things other people missed, knew he'd just seen something he wasn't supposed to see. And in a place like Greystone, that kind of knowledge never stayed quiet for long. Daniel didn't sleep much that night. He lay staring at the ceiling, replaying the image over and over, the warden, alone, still as a statue in a hallway that had no business being open. He told himself it was nothing. In a place like Greystone, you learn not to ask questions that weren't yours to ask. Greystone ran on rules nobody wrote down, but everyone understood. There was the official structure, the schedules, the head counts, the color-coded levels of privilege, and then there was the real structure, the one built on silence. Guards didn't talk about what happened on the night shift. Inmates didn't talk about what guards did or didn't see. And everyone in their own way answered to Warden Cross. She had built that kind of quiet power carefully. Cross didn't yell. She didn't need to. A single look from her in the mess hall could end a fight before it started. She remembered details, a mother's illness, a parole date, a nickname used only once. People underestimated how much control came from simply being remembered. The fluorescent lights in Greystone's halls buzzed a particular way, flickering just enough to remind you where you were every time you walked beneath them. The doors were heavy steel, and when they locked, the sound echoed down the corridor like a period at the end of a sentence, final, cold, impossible to argue with. Daniel had heard that sound thousands of times. He still felt it in his chest every time. He hadn't always been this quiet man in this cold place. Before Greystone, Daniel had a house with a crooked mailbox, a daughter who used to fall asleep on his chest, a wife who used to laugh at his bad jokes. Then came the night that ended all of it, a fight that spiraled out of control, a man who didn't survive it, and a jury that saw only the worst version of Daniel Reyes. His family hadn't survived it either, not really. His wife stopped visiting after year 3. His daughter's letters slowed, then stopped completely by year 6. By the time he hit year 8, Daniel had accepted a hard truth. The world outside these walls had already buried him. He was just waiting to catch up. That kind of loss did something to a man. It stripped away fear in strange ways. Daniel wasn't reckless, he was still careful, still smart, but he no longer had the kind of fear that made most inmates fall in line out of self-preservation. There was nothing left to threaten him with, no family to protect, no future to lose, just time ticking down toward a release date that felt more like a formality than a promise. Maybe that was why the warden had started looking at him the way she did. It wasn't obvious. It was small things, a longer pause during check-ins, a question about his file that had nothing to do with procedure, the way she sometimes appeared near the laundry room during hours she had no reason to be there. Daniel noticed. He always noticed. It was the one skill prison had sharpened in him better than anything else. He didn't understand it yet, not fully. But somewhere underneath the discipline and the silence, something unspoken had already started passing between them, a current neither of them had named, but both of them clearly felt. And in a place built entirely on rules, that unnamed thing was the most dangerous rule either of them had ever broken. It started small. A conversation that ran a few minutes longer than it should have. A file review that didn't need the inmate present, but somehow always did. Daniel told himself it was nothing more than curiosity on her part, some strange habit of a woman who liked control over every detail of her prison, right down to the men inside it. But by the third week he'd stopped believing that. The visits came late, always after the 10 o'clock count, always during the quiet stretch when the halls emptied out and the night shift thinned to a skeleton crew. There were no cameras in the East Wing storage corridor, a blind spot everyone knew about but nobody mentioned, a gap left over from a renovation that never got finished. Warden Cross knew the gap better than anyone. She'd found it years before Daniel ever noticed the door left open. Nothing about it was ever written down. No log, no note, no record that would exist if anyone ever came looking. That was the arrangement, unspoken but understood. Whatever passed between them in that corridor stayed in that corridor. Daniel wasn't foolish enough to call it anything close to affection. It was something colder than that, something built on two people using each other in different ways. Cross held every kind of power over him, his privileges, his parole file, his daily existence, and some nights it felt like she wanted to remind him of that as much as anything else. And Daniel, a man with nothing left to protect and nothing left to lose, had learned that closeness to power, even power that frightened him, was its own kind of currency in a place like this. Desperation didn't always look like weakness. Sometimes it looked exactly like this, two people circling something neither would admit out loud, each one certain they were the one in control. It was during this stretch of quiet, secret nights that Officer Marcus Bell started working the same shift. Bell was 26, new enough to still believe the job meant something, old enough to have already seen things that made him doubt it. He'd transferred to Greystone 8 months earlier, chasing steadier pay and a promotion track his old facility couldn't offer. He was sharp in a different way than Daniel, not street smart, not forged by years inside, but naturally observant, the kind of young man who noticed when a routine didn't add up. And Greystone's routines, especially around the East Wing, didn't always add up. He noticed the warden's office light off some nights when her car was still in the lot. He noticed the maintenance corridor door that sometimes sat unlocked past curfew, though maintenance logs showed no work scheduled. He noticed the way certain guards suddenly found reasons to avoid that hallway during rounds, the way a senior officer once told him, almost too casually, not to worry about that door, it wasn't his section. None of it made sense on its own. Bell wasn't the type to jump to conclusions, and he liked his job too much to go looking for trouble that might not exist. But something about the pattern nagged at him the way a smell nags at you long after you've left a room, faint, impossible to place, impossible to fully ignore. He didn't know Daniel Reyes yet, not really. Just a name on a roster, a quiet inmate with a clean record inside these walls. But one night, walking his rounds past that same corridor, Bell paused at the door a second longer than usual, staring at the dark gap beneath it. Something was happening in this prison that wasn't written down anywhere. And Marcus Bell, whether he realized it yet or not, had just started looking for it. The corridor was colder than usual that night, the kind of cold that crept in through the concrete and settled into your bones. Daniel stood in his usual spot near the shelving, half listening for footsteps, half watching the woman in front of him fumble with something she'd pulled from her jacket, a small metal case, out of place against her pressed uniform. She hadn't meant for him to see it. That much was obvious the second it slipped from her hands and hit the floor, popping open just enough to spill its contents across the concrete, an old photograph worn soft at the edges and a folded newspaper clipping yellowed with age. Cross dropped to her knees fast, scrambling to gather the pieces, but Daniel had already seen the photograph. A woman, younger, different hair, different name written in pen across the bottom corner. Not Elaine, someone else entirely. And beside her in the photo, an arm slung casually over her shoulder, stood a man Daniel recognized from somewhere, a face that had been on the news once years ago tied to something ugly, something people didn't forget. The clipping told the rest. A headline about a disappearance, a name that didn't match the one stitched onto the warden's uniform every single day. For a moment, nobody spoke. Daniel looked at her, really looked at her, and felt something shift in his chest, a strange, dark clarity settling over him. 11 years of reading people, 11 years of learning who was hiding what. And here finally was the truth about Elaine Cross laid out on cold concrete like evidence at a crime scene she never meant to be found at. He laughed. It wasn't humor. It came out low, disbelieving, almost hollow, the kind of laugh that escapes a man when the world tilts sideways and there's nothing left to do but acknowledge it. "You've got to be kidding me," he said, shaking his head. "This whole time, give that back." Her voice cracked on the last word, all that careful control draining out of it in an instant. "I didn't touch anything." "Daniel," she said his name like it hurt her to say it, like using it made the moment more real than she could stand. Her hands were shaking as she shoved the photograph and clipping back into the case, refusing to look at him now, refusing to let him see her face. You don't understand what that is. Then explain it. I can't. You can't or you won't. She finally looked up and Daniel watched something break across her features, the composed, untouchable Warden dissolving into something raw and frightened, something almost unrecognizable. Her eyes were wide, glassy under the dim corridor light, and for the first time in 6 years of running this prison like it belonged to her, Elaine Cross looked like a woman who had lost control of everything. You have no idea what I've done to protect that name, she whispered. What I've done to bury it, if this gets out. If what gets out. Daniel took a step closer, and for once he wasn't the desperate one in the room. Who is she, Elaine? Who were you before all this? Her mouth opened, then closed again. She pressed the metal case against her chest like it might shield her from the question itself, her breathing shallow and quick. You laughed, she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper, betrayal and fear tangled together in the words. You looked at my whole life falling apart and you laughed. Daniel didn't answer right away. He was still staring at her, still recalculating everything he thought he understood about the woman who controlled every hour of his existence. Maybe, he said slowly, because for the first time since I got here, you're the one who's scared. The silence that followed felt heavier than any locked door in this building. And somewhere down the hall, footsteps echoed closer, slow, deliberate, entirely too well-timed to be a coincidence. The footsteps passed without stopping, fading down a side corridor toward the west block, and Cross let out a breath she'd clearly been holding since the sound first started. She didn't move for a long moment, just stood there with the metal case pressed to her chest, staring at nothing. Daniel waited. He'd learned patience the same way he'd learned everything else in here, slowly and at a cost. What he'd seen in that corridor wasn't just an old photo. Over the days that followed in pieces, in fragments she let slip when the guilt became too heavy to carry alone, the truth started forming into something whole. Before she was Elaine Cross, she'd been someone else. A name from a different state, a different life, tied to a man whose face Daniel had recognized because it had once been plastered across regional news. A man convicted years ago of running a smuggling operation that moved more than just goods through a string of correctional facilities upstate. Contraband mostly. Money laundered through prison contracts, guards paid to look away, wardens paid more to make sure nobody asked questions. It had ended in a trial that put half a dozen men behind bars and left one woman's name buried deep enough in sealed testimony that she'd been able to walk away and become someone new. She'd changed her name legally, moved states, rebuilt a career from nothing, climbing the ranks of the correctional system with a discipline that Daniel now understood wasn't really about control at all. It was about disappearing so completely into a role that no one would ever look twice at the woman underneath it. Warden Elaine Cross wasn't just a title. It was a mask she'd built brick by brick, exactly the way Daniel had always sensed, except now he understood what the mask was hiding. But there was more, and this was the part that made her hands shake every time she came near it. Buried in that same past was a death nobody had ever properly investigated, a man who'd threatened to expose the old operation, found dead in a facility she'd worked at years before she came to Greystone. Officially ruled an accident. Unofficially, a debt she still carried, a silence she'd paid dearly to keep buried, because if anyone ever connected her old name to that death, everything she'd built, her career, her freedom, her entire second life would collapse in an instant. That was what Daniel had stumbled into, not an affair, not a secret weakness. A woman terrified of a past that could still reach into the present and destroy her, standing in a prison she now ran with an iron grip precisely because control was the only thing keeping her old life buried. Understanding that changed something in Daniel. For 11 years, he had been the one with nothing, no leverage, no power, no future worth protecting. He'd made peace with that a long time ago. But now, for the first time since the day he was sentenced, he was looking at someone more trapped than he was. Someone who had everything to lose. It wasn't a comfortable feeling, holding a secret like that. It sat heavy in his chest, dangerous in ways he was only beginning to understand. But underneath the danger, there was something else too, something he almost didn't want to admit to himself. For the first time in over a decade, Daniel Reyes felt something close to power. And in a place like Greystone, where every ounce of control belonged to someone else, that feeling was more intoxicating and more dangerous than he was ready for. Daniel didn't ask for much. That was the strange part, even he noticed it, the restraint in himself he hadn't expected. He didn't ask about parole, didn't ask her to bury paperwork or pull strings with the board. He asked for smaller things. An extra phone call to a cousin he hadn't spoken to in years. A transfer out of laundry duty into the library, where the light was better and the hours passed easier. A blind eye turned when he broke curfew by 10 minutes to finish a letter he never sent. Small mercies, that was all. But each one was a quiet reminder to both of them of what he knew and what she couldn't afford to have said out loud. Cross granted every request without argument. That more than anything told Daniel how deep her fear really ran. The old Elaine Cross, the one who ruled Greystone with a look and a silence, would have shut down a request like that in a heartbeat, would have reminded him exactly where the power in this building lived. This version of her simply nodded, signed what needed signing, and disappeared back into her office before he could see her hands shaking. She started watching him differently after that. Not with warmth, not with whatever strange current had passed between them before. This was something colder, more clinical. She watched him the way a person watches a wound they're afraid to touch, checking constantly to see if it's gotten worse. She'd pause mid-sentence in meetings if his name came up. She rewatched hallway footage more than she needed to, scanning for a face that always found a reason to walk past her office. Officer Bell noticed the change before almost anyone else did. It wasn't dramatic. It was small things stacked on top of each other. The warden approving requests for inmate 4471 that would have been denied for anyone else, the way she lingered a beat too long near his cell during rounds, the way her usual composure seemed to fracture just slightly whenever his file crossed her desk. Bell had spent months noticing patterns that didn't add up around Greystone's East Wing. Now he had a new one to add to the list. He started pulling records quietly after hours, careful not to draw attention. Transfer logs, disciplinary files, visitor requests. Nothing jumped out immediately, but the shape of something was there, buried under routine paperwork, an inmate receiving privileges with no clear justification, a warden whose usual iron discipline seemed to bend only around one name. Meanwhile, in the privacy of her office long after the building had gone quiet, Elaine Cross sat alone most nights with old files spread across her desk, files that had nothing to do with Greystone at all. Files from another life, another name, another set of walls she'd thought she'd left behind for good. Her hands trembled as she read through pages she'd memorized years ago, searching for cracks, searching for anything that could connect her old identity to the one she wore now. Sleep had become a stranger to her. She'd sit until the sky outside her window turned gray with early morning light, staring at photographs of a woman who no longer existed, wondering how much longer she could keep two lives from colliding. Somewhere down the hall, an inmate with nothing left to lose was slowly, carefully learning just how much power a secret could hold. And somewhere else in the building, a young officer had just begun asking questions that neither of them was ready for. The cracks didn't show all at once. They showed in the way Cross snapped at a guard for a mistake that wouldn't have mattered a month earlier. In the way her hand hesitated over her own signature during morning briefings, as if she'd forgotten for half a second which name belonged to her now. To understand how she'd gotten here, you had to go back further than Greystone, further than the name Elaine Cross itself. She'd been 23 when she first got pulled into the operation upstate, young, broke, and dating a man who made promises sound like guarantees. She hadn't known, not at first, what she was really part of. By the time she understood, she was already in too deep to walk away clean. She watched people disappear for asking the wrong questions. She learned to stay quiet, to keep her head down, to survive the only way anyone in that world survived, by becoming useful enough that nobody thought to get rid of her. When it finally collapsed, when the trial came and half the men she'd known went to prison, she'd been given a choice most people never got. A new name, a sealed file, a chance to become someone the past couldn't touch. She'd taken it without hesitation. She built Elaine Cross out of discipline and distance, out of the belief that if she controlled everything around her tightly enough, nothing from that old life would ever crawl its way back in. Daniel Reyes had cracked that control in one careless moment, and now every day felt like standing on ice that was thinning beneath her feet. She went to him again on a Thursday night, later than usual, her composure barely holding. The corridor felt colder than before, or maybe it was just her. She asked, not bothering with any pretense. "Tell me, whatever it is, just tell me." Daniel studied her for a long moment. "I already told you, small things don't stay small," she snapped, then caught herself, softening, desperation bleeding through the cracks in her voice. "You could ruin me with one phone call, one letter to the wrong person. Why haven't you? Maybe I'm still deciding. That's not an answer. It's the only one I've got." Leaned back against the wall, arms crossed, watching her unravel in real time. "You want to know what I want? I want to understand why a woman who runs this whole place like she owns it is standing in front of me shaking like she's the one in a cell. Her jaw tight. You don't know anything about what I've survived. Then tell me." "I can't." Her voice cracked on the word, raw and exhausted. "Do you understand what happens to me if this gets out? Not just my job, Daniel, everything. My freedom, maybe my life. And what happens to me if I keep quiet forever?" He shot back. "What do I get out of protecting a secret that isn't mine?" She stared at him, something desperate and calculating moving behind her eyes. "What if I could get you out early? Real freedom, not favors. Would that buy your silence?" The offer hung in the cold air between them, heavier than anything either of them had said yet. Daniel didn't answer right away. For the first time since this all began, he wasn't sure what he wanted the answer to be. And neither, it seemed, was she. Daniel never gave her an answer that night, and in the days that followed, he almost regretted it. Because something in the building shifted after that conversation, subtle but unmistakable to a man who'd survived 11 years by noticing exactly this kind of thing. It started with a guard he didn't recognize. A man in his 40s, quiet, efficient, doing a headcount on a wing that wasn't his usual rotation. He looked at Daniel a beat too long, the way you'd study a photograph rather than a person, and then moved on without a word. Daniel asked around afterward. Nobody knew his name. Nobody remembered seeing him before that week, and nobody saw him again after. Then came the tray. Dinner, a Tuesday, nothing unusual about the line or the servers except the taste. Bitter, chemical, wrong in a way Daniel couldn't quite place but trusted immediately. He'd eaten prison food for over a decade. He knew what bad food tasted like. This wasn't that. He pushed the tray away and told himself it was nothing, that paranoia was just another thing this place had taught him too well. The paperwork was harder to explain away. A routine form crossed his cell during a cell check, a transfer request, his name typed neatly at the top, a signature at the bottom that was supposed to be his but wasn't. He'd never seen the document before. He'd certainly never signed it. When he asked about it, the guard on duty shrugged and said it must have been a clerical mix-up, filed and forgotten within the hour. Daniel lay awake that night longer than usual, staring at the same ceiling tiles he'd counted 1,000 times before, except now the dread sat differently in his chest. He thought about the guard with no name, the tray that tasted wrong, the signature that wasn't his, small things, each one explainable on its own. Together, they formed a shape he didn't like. He thought about Elaine Cross's offer, the desperation in her voice, the way she'd asked what it would take to buy his silence. He wondered for the first time whether silence was even still on the table, or whether someone had already decided a different kind of quiet would be easier to arrange. 2 floors away, Officer Marcus Bell sat with a growing stack of inconsistencies he couldn't yet explain, and a feeling he couldn't shake that something was closing in around Inmate 4471. He'd tried to request a private conversation with Daniel twice that week, citing a routine welfare check, something vague enough not to raise flags. Both times he'd been turned away, told Ray's was scheduled for review, told there was no availability, told in a tone that made it clear the conversation was over to stick to his own section. Bell stood outside the administration office after the second refusal, staring down the hallway toward the block where Daniel was housed, that same nagging unease sitting heavy in his gut. Something was happening to that inmate. He was sure of it now. He just didn't know if he'd figure out what before it was too late to matter. They found him just after 6 in the morning during the first count of the day. The guard who opened the cell would later say he knew before he even stepped inside something about the stillness, the way the light fell across the floor without anything moving to break it. Daniel Reyes was lying near his bunk, one arm outstretched like he'd been reaching for something just out of reach. His eyes were closed. His face looked calm, almost peaceful, in a way that felt wrong for a man who'd spent his last week circling something he couldn't outrun. The infirmary staff arrived within minutes. Then the on-call physician. Then not long after, Warden Cross herself, standing in the doorway of the cell with an expression nobody in the room could quite read, grief maybe, or something closer to relief, wearing grief's clothing. The official cause of death came quickly: cardiac arrest. Natural causes. No signs of struggle, no marks, nothing on the initial exam to suggest anything other than a heart that had simply quietly stopped. The paperwork moved even faster than the diagnosis, forms signed, boxes checked, a file closed before the sun had fully risen over Greystone's gray walls. There was something almost too smooth about how quickly it all came together. The corridor outside Daniel's cell was cleaned within the hour. The tray from his last meal, if anyone had thought to save it, was already gone, lost somewhere in the kitchen's rotation. The unfamiliar guard who'd appeared on his wing days earlier didn't show up for his next shift, and when someone finally asked about him, no one could produce a name that matched any employee record. Word moved through the facility the way it always did: fast, then careful, then silent. Inmates who'd known Daniel exchanged looks in the yard that said more than words could. Guards who'd worked his block filed their reports and said nothing else. Everyone understood, without needing to say it out loud, that some deaths in a place like this were meant to be accepted quietly and never questioned. Everyone except Officer Marcus Bell. He stood at the edge of the cell that morning, watching the scene unfold with a knot tightening in his stomach that had nothing to do with the sight of a body. He thought about the strange guard, the tray Daniel had pushed away half-eaten days before. The transfer paperwork with a signature that didn't belong to the man who was supposed to have signed it. The 2 times he'd tried to check on Reyes privately and been turned away for reasons that suddenly felt less like protocol and more like something else entirely. Cardiac arrest. Natural causes. The words sat wrong in his mouth even as his superiors repeated them like a fact already settled. He didn't say anything that morning. He knew better than to speak too soon in a building where the wrong question, asked to the wrong person, could end a career, or worse. But that night, alone in his apartment outside the facility gates, Bell pulled out a notebook and began writing down everything he remembered, every strange detail from the past 3 weeks, in the careful, deliberate handwriting of a man who intended to keep asking questions until someone gave him an answer that made sense. Somewhere inside Greystone, a file marked closed sat on Warden Cross's desk. But for Marcus Bell, the case had only just begun. Bell started with the logs because logs were supposed to be honest even when people weren't. He pulled shift records for the week leading up to Daniel's death, cross-referencing them against the visitor and maintenance logs he'd already been quietly collecting for months. It took 3 nights of working after his own shifts ended, sitting in his car in the far corner of the staff lot where no one would notice his laptop screen glowing in the dark. The gaps were there, once he knew where to look. A maintenance entry for the East Wing corridor, logged as routine, on a night when no work order existed to explain it. A guard shift swapped last minute, the replacement officer's name misspelled 2 different ways on 2 different forms, as if whoever filled them out hadn't actually known who they were writing about. And the unfamiliar guard from Daniel's final week, the one nobody could produce a record for, appeared exactly once in the entire system, in a single sign-in sheet that had somehow been overlooked when the rest of the paperwork was cleaned up. The autopsy report troubled him most. It was thin, hurried, missing details Bell had seen included in every other in-custody death file he'd ever reviewed. No toxicology screening requested, no note on stomach contents, nothing beyond a brief line confirming cardiac arrest and a signature from a physician Bell didn't recognize, one who didn't appear on Greystone's regular contracted staff list. He raised it carefully once to a senior officer he thought he could trust. The response was immediate and cold. Drop it, focus on your own section, some things aren't worth the trouble of asking about twice. 2 days later, the guard who'd been on duty the night Daniel's cell was last checked put in a sudden transfer request, approved within 24 hours, unusually fast for a facility that normally buried such requests in paperwork for weeks. By the following Monday, he was gone, reassigned 3 states away, no forwarding contact left behind. Bell understood with a clarity that settled cold in his chest that he wasn't just investigating a death anymore. He was investigating people who knew exactly how to make problems disappear. He kept digging anyway. The piece that finally connected everything came almost by accident, a supply requisition form buried in a stack of unrelated paperwork he'd requested under the guise of a routine audit. It documented a late-night access code used to unlock the East Wing storage corridor on the same night Daniel died. Timestamped at 1:47 a.m., the code belonged to exactly one person in the entire facility: Warden Elaine Cross. Bell stared at the page for a long time, the hum of his refrigerator the only sound in his otherwise silent apartment. There it was not proof of what had happened, not yet, but proof that the warden herself had been in that corridor during the very hours Daniel Reyes had drawn his last breath, at a facility that insisted nothing unusual had occurred that night at all. He thought about the officer who'd told him to drop it. He thought about the transfer that happened just a little too fast, the autopsy that asked a little too little. He thought about a quiet inmate named Daniel Reyes who had somehow become dangerous enough to disappear. Bell closed his laptop, hands unsteady, and made a decision that would put everything he had on the line. It was time to confront her directly. Bell requested the meeting through official channels, careful to leave a paper trail this time, something that would exist even if he didn't walk out of that office the same way he walked in. Warden Cross agreed without hesitation, which surprised him more than it should have. Maybe some part of her already knew this conversation was coming. Maybe some part of her had been waiting for it since the night Daniel's cell went quiet. Her office looked the same as always, orderly, controlled, every folder squared to the edge of the desk, but Cross herself looked different. Thinner somehow, the confidence that once filled the room now stretched thin across her face like something barely holding together. "You wanted to talk," she said, folding her hands in front of her. "About what?" Bell set a single folder on her desk and didn't open it yet. "The night Daniel Reyes died, your access code was used in the East Wing storage corridor at 1:47 a.m. I have the requisition log. I have the autopsy report with no toxicology screening. I have a guard nobody can identify who appeared once in your system and vanished. And I have another officer transferred out within 24 hours of me asking questions." Her jaw tightened. "You're building a story out of paperwork errors." "I'm building a story out of the truth, Warden, and I think you know that better than anyone." Silence stretched between them, heavy and cold. For a moment, Bell thought she might simply deny it forever, bury it the way she'd apparently buried everything else in her life. But then something in her posture broke slowly, like ice giving way beneath weight it could no longer hold. "He found something he wasn't supposed to find," she said finally, voice quiet, almost hollow. "Something from before Greystone, before this name." She looked up at Bell, eyes glassy but steady. "I never wanted him dead. I want you to understand that. I never gave that order." "Then what happened?" "I panicked." Her hands were shaking now, the careful composure she'd worn like armor for 6 years finally cracking apart in front of him. "I told someone from my old life, someone I thought could help me control the situation. I thought he'd threaten him, scare him into silence. I didn't think," her voice broke completely, "I didn't think it would go that far." "You mean you had him killed?" "I mean I made a call I can never take back." Tears slid down her face now, not performative, not calculated, just the raw collapse of a woman who had spent years running from one truth only to be buried by another. Daniel didn't deserve what happened to him. He was the only person who ever really saw me, not the warden, not the name on the door, me. And I let fear turn that into something unforgivable. Bell felt something twist in his chest, not sympathy exactly, but something close to it, tangled up with anger and grief for a man he'd barely known but had spent weeks fighting for anyway. "You're going to have to tell all of this to people who aren't me." "I know," she whispered. The weeks that followed moved faster than anyone at Greystone expected. Bell's evidence, combined with Cross's eventual full confession, triggered a state investigation that peeled back layers of the facility's culture of silence. The guards who'd looked away, the paperwork built to disappear, the years of quiet complicity that had let one woman's past finally catch up with someone else's present. Elaine Cross was arrested and charged, her second identity exposed in headlines that reached the very people she'd spent a lifetime hiding from. The old case upstate reopened. The man in the photograph faced questions he'd long thought buried. And somewhere in all of it, a woman who had built an entire life out of control finally lost every piece of it. Officer Marcus Bell was reassigned, praised quietly by some, resented quietly by others, forever changed by 3 weeks that started with a hunch and ended with a truth nobody wanted to hear. Daniel Reyes's name was cleared of the small, quiet suspicion that had followed his death, no longer a footnote in a closed file, but a man whose story finally mattered enough to be told correctly. His daughter, the one who'd stopped writing years before, was informed of what really happened. She visited his grave for the first time that spring, laying flowers on a stone that had waited a long time for someone to remember the man beneath it. Some secrets cost more than the people who keep them ever expect to pay, and in the end, it's rarely the ones who deserve it most who pay the highest price. If this story moved you, don't forget to like, subscribe, and follow for more true crime stories like this one.